What's up, everybody? It's Izzy, and in today's video, we're going to talk about peaking. So, first of all, peaking is not a magical process by which you get a bunch stronger on one day, okay? It's not designed to give you some huge 5, 10, 15% boost to your regular numbers on meet day. That's not how it works. So to understand peaking, what you have to understand is the two-factor model for performance, right? There's two factors. One is fitness and one is fatigue. So fitness would be your underlying level of strength in powerlifting, right? If you had zero fatigue, what could you lift that day? Your fatigue level is something that fluctuates a lot through training, right? If you just did a hard squat workout the day before, you're still going to be under-recovered from that workout. Generally speaking, as you progress through a training cycle, you're going to accumulate fatigue. The reason for this is that in order to keep getting gains, you have to train harder and harder. And as you're training harder and harder, there's going to be incomplete recovery and fatigue will accumulate. So a great example to understand this is, let's say you try to squat on back-to-back days. And on day one, you do a crazy squat workout with tons of volume. The next day that you go to the gym, you're going to be significantly weaker, especially if you're not adapted to this style of training of multiple days of squatting in a row with high volume. Okay, you're going to be significantly weaker. Does that mean that your underlying level of fitness went down in one day? Did you lose a bunch of muscle and strength in one day? Of course not. The big increase of fatigue because you squatted yesterday is masking some of your fitness. So you want to think of these two factors, right? And the difference between them, your fitness and your fatigue, so imagine two lines on a graph, is your readiness. And your readiness on any given day is your ability to display your strength, okay? And what a peaking process ideally does is it reduces fatigue as low as possible while keeping fitness as high as possible. So it makes the gap between those two curves on the graph as big as possible. The point of peaking, for the most part, with some very, very rare exceptions, is not to get you so that you're super compensating on the day of the meet. It's just to make sure that you can display the strength that you've built without fatigue interfering. All right? Now, the first and most old school peaking strategy is just a gradual taper. What that means is that over the course of 3 to 4 weeks, you're going to slowly reduce the volume so that you have less fatigue on game day, but you're not losing performance. So a classic example of this would be linear periodization, right? Where let's say 4 weeks out, you do 5 sets of 5, and then 3 weeks out, you do 3 sets of 3, and then 2 weeks out you do 2 sets of 2, and 1 week out you do your opener. Let's just say that for example. Okay, you can see that there's a gradual decrease in volume, a pretty large one actually, and by the time that the meet comes around, you're going to have almost, a lot less fatigue than you did in the middle of the training cycle. And this is the safest way to peak. And the reason why this is the safest way to peak is because with the gradual taper, you're very unlikely to lose a lot of strength. And the reason for that, of course, is that your volume is remaining pretty similar. You're also less likely to mess up the peak because you have more time for that fatigue to dissipate, okay? Because it lasts 3 to 4 weeks, you're more likely to ensure that there's not a bunch of underlying fatigue that messes up your performance on the day of the meet. Now, the advantage of this, of course, is that it's hard to mess up. But the disadvantage is that you might have the last 3 to 4 weeks where you're not really increasing your underlying level of fitness. You're just reducing fatigue to improve your readiness. So you'll get stronger from week to week in terms of the weight that you can lift and the RPEs, but your underlying level of fitness will not increase. Okay, this is a generalization. Keep that in mind. We're talking about this from a theoretical perspective. Probably the next way that people peak is more with a steep taper. Okay, and with this one, what you're going to do is you're going to resume regular and hard training for a lot longer. And then really close to the meet, you'll have a really significant drop in volume. So let's say that 2 weeks out, you're still basically doing normal training loads. But then the week of the meet, you do almost nothing, right? And a classic example of this would be Smolov, the base mesocycle, where you do 3 weeks of just 4 times per week squatting at these crazy volumes, and then you take an entire week off as the peak. That would be an example of a steep taper. Now, of course, the advantage of this is that you train for longer closer to the peak, meaning you have more time to accumulate gains and increase your underlying level of fitness. The problem with it, of course, is that it becomes a lot easier to mistime the peak, okay? If you rest for too long, then your fitness starts to decrease. But if you, even worse, if you don't rest enough, you'll go into the meet feeling like shit still, you'll be under recovered, and your readiness won't be maximized. So this takes a lot more experience than a gradual taper. A steep taper requires that you know the athlete well, you know yourself well, and you know how much time you need in order to fully recover from a normal training load. So this is, like I said, riskier, but the advantage is that you can train for longer, okay? Closer to the meet and still get stronger. The last way is that people will actually try to functionally overreach to create super compensation on the day of the meet. So to contradict what I said at the beginning of the video just a bit, this style of peaking is where you're actually purposely overreaching and accumulating enough fatigue that performance is going down into the final weeks of training. You're training so much that performance is going down, right? And then what you're trying to do with a steep taper or another type of taper is time it perfectly so that when you rebound from all that overreaching and that excessive fatigue, it's exactly on meet day. Now, the advantage of this, obviously, is that if you get the timing just right, and it's even harder to do than a regular steep taper, if you get the timing just right, you get a small super compensation effect that allows you to lift more on the day of the meet than you would normally lift during any other type of training. The disadvantage, of course, is that you need a lot of experience to do this, okay? A lot of experience to do this. You need to know the athlete incredibly well, or you need to know yourself incredibly well, or you can mistime the peak and ruin their meet. Really, you can, because they can go into the meet just destroyed still and not be able to lift within, 5, 6, 7% of what they normally did rather than getting some sort of percentage boost. So anyway, I guess the point that I really want to make here is that it's really popular nowadays for people to just beat the shit out of themselves going into a meet, and that is one way to do it, okay? And then using like a steep taper or trying to get that super compensation effect on the day of the meet. And yes, this does work if you time it right. If you time it perfectly, in the case of, trying to super compensate for the meet. However, for more of you beginners out there or intermediates who don't have a lot of experience with peaking and you don't necessarily know how it works all that well, I would really recommend that you start off with a more gradual tapering strategy. It's much harder to mess up and you'll be much more confident going into meet day, all right? You can be more sure that you don't have a bunch of fatigue, and you will feel great in the last few weeks of training as fatigue is gradually dropping and your readiness is increasing. For more advanced athletes, it may be worth it to experiment with tapering strategies that are steeper, or even trying to, time a super compensation cycle where you functionally overreach heading into the meet. But these are advanced techniques that are best left to advanced athletes. And the biggest point here is that you do not have to beat the shit out of yourself heading into a meet, feeling like crap every single week before the meet in order to have a good meet. In fact, this decreases your chances of having a good meet unless you're very experienced or working with a coach that knows what they're doing. Instead, I would recommend the gradual taper, like I already said. You're going to have a much higher chance of success, and at the very worst, you'll be able to lift what your gym numbers indicate that you can lift, rather than having this day where the weights feel heavier than normal and you feel like crap. Because nothing is more discouraging, in my experience, than going to the meet and lifting less and worse than you did all throughout your training. Anyways, guys, that's all I have to say on the topic of peaking for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, have a nice day and good luck through training. Peace.